She was just a nurse, he said. Replaceable. Then a 4-star general collapsed in his lobby, and the replaceable nurse was the only one who knew what to do. Now let me take you inside St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, just hours before everything changed. The air in the emergency department always tasted the same. It was a sterile, metallic cocktail of bleach, latex, and the faint, sweet odor of blood, all underpinned by the bitter scent of stale coffee that fueled the staff through their 24-hour cycles of controlled chaos. To Nurse Alara Vance, it was the smell of Tuesday. It was the smell of just another shift. She moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors with an economy of motion that bordered on invisibility. Her steps were silent on the linoleum, her hands sure as they adjusted an IV drip, checked a patient's chart, or offered a cup of water. She was good at her job, not just proficient, but deeply, intuitively competent. She could read the subtle grammar of a patient's pallor, the faint tremor in a visitor's hand, the almost imperceptible shift in the rhythm of the monitors that signaled a coming crisis. Her colleagues respected her for it, a quiet and solid respect built on the foundation of countless nights when her calm presence had been the anchor in a storm of screaming, panic, and medical emergency. She was a known quantity, a safe pair of hands. But to the men in expensive suits who occasionally swept through the ward like visiting royalty, she was part of the background, a fixture, a uniform, replaceable. Alistair Finch, the chief executive officer of St. Jude's, was the chief purveyor of that particular brand of dismissiveness. He was a man carved from polished marble and quiet disdain, his suits immaculate, his smile a thin, bloodless slash that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He didn't walk through the hospital. He conducted inspections, his gaze sweeping over the scuffed floors and harried staff as if tallying up deficiencies. Alara felt the shift in atmosphere before she saw him. A subtle tension, a stiffening of spines. Nurses checked their stations. Doctors subconsciously straightened their scrubs. Finch was on the floor. She was in the middle of documenting a patient's intake when his voice, smooth as expensive whiskey and just as biting, cut through the low hum of the ER. "Nurse Vance, is it?" Alara turned slowly, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. She kept her hands resting on the worn plastic of the charting station, a small act of grounding herself. "Yes, Mr. Finch." He was flanked by 2 of his administrative acolytes, younger men in ill-fitting suits who mirrored his stern expression with practiced sycophancy. Finch held a tablet, and he tapped a finger on its screen with theatrical displeasure. "I'm reviewing a patient feedback report from yesterday," he said, his voice loud enough for half the ward to hear. The air grew still. This was a public dressing down, one of Finch's signature management techniques. A Mr. Abernathy complains of unnecessary roughness during a blood draw and a cold, dismissive attitude. "That was you, I believe." Alara's mind flashed back. Mr. Abernathy, an elderly man, terrified of needles, his veins thin and rolling. She had spent 10 minutes calming him, her voice low and steady. She had been quick, precise, and successful on the first try, a small victory in a busy shift. The roughness was the necessary pressure to hold a fragile vein. The coldness was her focus. "Mr. Abernathy was highly anxious, sir," she explained, her voice even. "My priority was to complete the draw efficiently to minimize his distress." Finch raised an eyebrow. The expression was a masterpiece of condescension. "Your priority, Nurse Vance, is patient satisfaction. Our scores in that metric have been slipping. We're a business, not a charity. The perception of care is just as important as the care itself, perhaps more so from a financial perspective. A low, simmering anger began to curl in Alara's stomach. She thought of the short staffing, the aging infusion pumps she had to constantly recalibrate, the cheap bandages that barely stuck to skin. Finch's financial perspective was the reason they were struggling to provide the very care he was now criticizing. "My focus was on the patient's medical needs," she stated, clipping the words. Finch's smile vanished. It was like a light being switched off. "That is precisely the kind of attitude that is costing this hospital money. It's a mentality of insubordination. You are a line item on a budget, nurse. A cog in a very large, very expensive machine." "And cogs," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout, "can be replaced, easily." He held her gaze for a beat too long, a silent assertion of dominance. He was daring her to challenge him, to give him the excuse he needed. Alara felt a familiar, cold fire ignite deep within her. It was an old feeling, one she had worked hard to bury beneath layers of quiet professionalism and civilian life. It was the feeling of facing down an enemy who held all the immediate power, but possessed none of the actual strength. Her shoulders tensed for a fraction of a second, an internal switch being flipped. Her training, buried but not gone, screamed at her to analyze the threat. Finch was all bluster, a man who derived power from his title, not from any inherent capability. He was soft, predictable, but he was dangerous in the way a rock slide is dangerous, unthinking, destructive, and set in motion by its own weight. She forced her muscles to relax. She gave him nothing, just a steady, unblinking stare. She would not be the one to break the silence. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Finch seemed to realize he wasn't going to get the reaction he wanted. He straightened up, his mask of authority sliding back into place. "Consider this your formal warning," he said loudly, for the benefit of the audience. "Another report like this, and we'll be discussing your severance. Am I clear?" "Crystal," Alara said, her voice flat and empty of the emotion that churned inside her. He gave a curt nod, turned on his heel, and swept away, his acolytes trailing in his wake like pilot fish. The ambient noise of the ER slowly returned, but the tension remained, clinging to the air like smoke. Her colleagues offered her sympathetic glances, but no one said a word. No one could afford to. Finch had made his point. Alara turned back to her charting station, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Replaceable. The word echoed in her mind, a dull, throbbing insult. She had been called worse. She had faced far more terrifying threats than a man in $1,000 suit. But here, in this life she had carefully built, the word felt different. It was a dismissal not just of her job, but of her skill, her dedication, her very worth in this world she had chosen. She took a slow, deep breath, the way she'd been taught. In through the nose for 4, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. Box breathing. It centered her, pushing the anger down, encasing it in ice. Anger was a liability. Emotion was a variable you couldn't control. She finished her charting, her fingers moving with renewed precision. Then she went to check on her next patient. She pushed the humiliation down. She had a job to do. That was all that mattered. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine and quiet diligence. She changed dressings, administered medications, and spoke to anxious family members in a low, calming voice. But underneath the surface of her professionalism, a part of her was on high alert. Finch's threat had been more than a simple warning. It had been a promise. He had marked her. As the clock on the wall crept toward the end of her shift, the hospital's main lobby began to fill with an unusual energy. The normal foot traffic of visitors and departing patients was supplemented by men and women in sharp business attire, members of the press with cameras, and a palpable sense of anticipation. Ilara, on her way to the locker room, paused by the ER entrance, curiosity getting the better of her. Maria, one of the triage nurses, leaned over the counter. "Big donation," Maria whispered, nodding toward the lobby. "Some 4-star general is here to present the hospital with a massive check for a new pediatric wing. Finch has been preening all week." Ilara glanced through the glass doors. She could see Alistair Finch standing near the main entrance, his posture radiating smug satisfaction. He was laughing with a group of board members, his smile wide and utterly false. He was in his element, basking in the reflected glory of money and power. And then she saw the general. Even from a distance, he was an unmistakable figure of authority. General Marcus Thorne. His name was well known, a man with a storied 30-year career, a legend in certain circles. He wasn't a large man, but he possessed a density, a centeredness that seemed to bend the space around him. His dress uniform was immaculate, his shoulders a testament to a lifetime of discipline. But it wasn't the general that caught Ilara's trained eye. It was the men with him, 2 of them. They stood slightly behind him, 1 on each flank. They wore simple, well-tailored dark suits, but they didn't belong in this crowd of politicians and executives. Their posture was too perfect, their gaze too active. They weren't looking at the general or the cameras. They were scanning the crowd, the exits, the second-floor balcony. Their hands were relaxed, but never far from the front of their jackets. Ilara knew that stance. She knew that look. It was the calm, predatory stillness of a professional watching for threats. She had stood that way herself 1,000 times in another life, in another country, wearing dust-colored fatigues instead of blue scrubs. These were not corporate security guards. They were his personal security detail, military, likely Tier 1 operators assigned to protect a high-value asset. Her body recognized theirs on a primal, cellular level. A jolt, like a phantom limb aching, went through her, a ghost of who she used to be. She shook her head, turning away from the scene. It wasn't her world anymore. She had traded the arid heat of combat zones for the sterile chill of a hospital. Her only concern now was changing out of her scrubs and heading home to her small, quiet apartment. She was halfway to the locker room when the first shout echoed from the lobby. It was a sound of alarm, sharp and sudden, cutting through the polite murmur of the crowd. It was followed by a collective gasp, then more shouts, a rising wave of panic. Ilara stopped. Her head snapped back toward the lobby doors. Every nerve ending in her body was suddenly on fire. She knew that sound. It was the sound of something going terribly, horribly wrong. She didn't think. She moved. Years of training took over, overriding the tired nurse who just wanted to go home. She pivoted on the balls of her feet and ran back toward the chaos, her quiet footsteps now hard, percussive strikes on the floor. She pushed through the glass doors into the lobby, and the scene hit her like a physical blow. The crowd, moments before ordered and formal, was now a panicked mob, stumbling backward, creating a chaotic circle in the center of the gleaming floor. Cameras were flashing wildly, capturing the disaster. In the middle of that circle, General Marcus Thorne was on the ground. Alistair Finch was standing over him, his face a mask of horror, his arms flapping uselessly. "Someone do something! Get a doctor! Call a code!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. One of the general's security men was on his knee beside him, speaking into his wrist. The other had drawn his weapon, not pointing it, but holding it low in a ready position as he created a perimeter, his voice a low, commanding bark. "Back up! Give him space! Now!" Alara's eyes took in the scene in a fraction of a second, her brain processing the data with chilling efficiency. General Thorne was on his back, his face rapidly turning a dusky, purplish color. His lips were blue. His breaths were short, raspy, a high-pitched wheezing sound. Strider. His eyes were wide with terror as he clawed at his own throat. Classic signs of acute anaphylaxis. A severe, life-threatening allergic reaction. A hospital crash cart, summoned by Finch's screams, was being hastily wheeled over by a young resident who looked barely out of medical school. He fumbled with the drawers, his hand shaking. "It's anaphylaxis!" the resident yelled, his voice tight with panic. "I need an EpiPen," one of the board members, a woman in a Chanel suit, pointed a trembling finger at a nearby catering table laden with canapes. "The shrimp puffs! He just ate one of the shrimp puffs! He must be allergic!" The resident finally located an epinephrine auto-injector from the cart. He ripped off the cap, his movements jerky and unsure. He jabbed it into the general's thigh, through the thick fabric of his uniform. Alara watched, her body coiled like a spring. 1 milligram of epinephrine, standard procedure. They waited. 1 second, 3, 5, nothing. The general's wheezing grew louder, more desperate. The dusky color of his skin deepened. "It's not working!" the resident cried out, his face pale with sweat. "It's not working!" Finch looked like he was about to faint. "What do you mean it's not working? Do it again! It's a hospital, for God's sake!" Alara saw it then, the missing piece. The resident was doing what he was taught, but the equipment was failing. Her mind flashed to Finch's words, a financial perspective, the cheap bandages, the old pumps. What other corners had he cut? The epinephrine. It had to be substandard, expired, or counterfeit medication. It wouldn't be the first time a hospital administrator had tried to save a few dollars by sourcing from a shady supplier. The dose the resident administered was probably no more effective than a shot of saline. The general had maybe 60 seconds left. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could stay back, let the hospital team fail, and let the consequences fall on Finch. It would be justice, in a way. Or she could act. If you were Alara, in that exact moment, seeing the system you work for fail so catastrophically at the feet of the man who embodies its corruption, would you step in and save him from the consequences? Or would you let events unfold, knowing it could mean the end of a man's life, but also the exposure of the rot? She didn't hesitate for another second. "Get out of the way," she said, her voice low and charged with an authority that no one in the hospital had ever heard from her. She pushed through the inner circle of onlookers, her movements fluid and decisive. The young resident looked up, startled. Finch's head swiveled toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Nurse Vance, what are you doing? Stay back," he commanded. Alara ignored him completely. Her entire world had narrowed to the dying man on the floor. She dropped to her knees beside him, her mind a steel trap of calculations and procedures. The security man with the gun, the one creating the perimeter, shifted his stance to block her. His eyes, hard as flint, locked onto hers, Ma'am, I need you to— His airway is closing, Ilara snapped, not looking at him, her hands already moving. He's got less than a minute before hypoxic brain injury. The epi from your cart is useless. She tilted the general's head back, checking his carotid pulse with 2 fingers. It was faint and thready. Tachycardic. The second security man, the one on his knee, looked from his partner to Ilara. He was older, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. He was the team lead. His name tag, barely visible, read Evans. He saw the certainty in her movements, the absolute lack of panic. He saw competence. "Let her work," Evans said, his voice a low rumble. His partner hesitated for a split second, then gave a curt nod and stepped back, re-establishing his perimeter, his focus once again on the crowd. Ilara's hands flew to the crash cart. She bypassed the useless auto-injectors and ripped open a drawer containing sterile kits. Her eyes scanned, cataloging, discarding. She needed a direct, more invasive route. "I need a 10cc syringe with a 22-gauge needle, a vial of cardiac epinephrine, and an alcohol swab," she ordered, her voice clear and ringing in the suddenly silent lobby. The young resident, shocked into action by her command, started fumbling to get the items. "Hurry," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. As he gathered the supplies, her gaze flickered to Colonel Evans. He was watching her every move, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. He was assessing her. He knew this was not standard procedure for a floor nurse. This was something else. Now. While she waited for the syringe, she placed her left hand on the general's sternum, ostensibly to feel for the rhythm of his failing heart. Her fingers were spread, pressing firmly. Then she performed a sequence of taps. It wasn't random. It was a code. Tap, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. It was a modified tap code, an old field signal used by special operations units to communicate silently when radios were down. It meant, "Friend, under duress, require support." It was an obscure signal, one you would only know if you had been in very specific, very dangerous places. A signal she hadn't used in almost a decade. Colonel Evans's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. For a single, heart-stopping moment, he did nothing. Then his gaze flickered from her hand to her face, and a spark of recognition, of disbelief, and then of profound understanding lit his eyes. His entire posture shifted. The subtle tension in his shoulders bled away, replaced by a focused calm. He had been watching a civilian. Now he was watching an asset, one of his own. The resident shoved the supplies into her hand. Ilara worked with a speed that was mesmerizing. She ripped open the alcohol swab and wiped a small area on the general's chest, just to the side of his sternum. She drew exactly 1 cubic centimeter of the potent cardiac epinephrine into the syringe, a dose that would be dangerously high if administered incorrectly. Finch finally found his voice. "What in God's name are you doing? That's not the protocol. You'll kill him." "He's already dying," Ilara shot back without looking up. "Your protocol failed." She located the 4th intercostal space with her fingers, a direct line to the heart muscle. An intracardiac injection. It was a last-ditch, high-risk procedure, one taught to combat medics for worst-case scenarios in the field when an IV line was impossible. It was not something you did in a hospital lobby. With absolute steadiness, she plunged the needle into the general's chest. She aspirated briefly to ensure she wasn't in a chamber, then depressed the plunger. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The general's body arched off the floor in a massive, convulsive spasm. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. For a horrifying second, he was completely still. Finch let out a whimpering sound. "You've killed him!" But Alara was watching the man's throat. The terrible, high-pitched wheezing stopped. It was replaced by a deep, ragged, glorious gulp of air. Then another. The dusky purple of his skin began to recede, replaced by a blotchy red, then a healthier pink. His eyes, which had been wide with terror, fluttered and closed. His breathing, though still labored, was deep and even. A collective sigh of relief went through the lobby. The silence was broken by a smattering of stunned applause. Alara pulled the syringe out and carefully placed it on the cart. She checked the general's pulse again. It was still fast, but it was strong and regular. She had done it. She had pulled him back from the brink. The hospital's official code team finally arrived, a flurry of doctors and nurses pushing through the crowd. They stopped short, seeing the patient breathing, the crisis seemingly over. "What happened?" the lead doctor asked, looking at Alara. Before she could answer, Colonel Ivan stepped forward, placing himself between Alara and the new arrivals. His voice was pure command. "This team has it. We're taking him," he said. It wasn't a request. He gestured to his own people, who were already moving in with a gurney and a portable monitor. They were a seamless professional unit, the hospital's team looking clumsy by comparison. They transferred the general onto their gurney with practiced ease. As they prepared to move, Evans turned his head slightly. "Good work," he said, his voice low and meant only for Alara. It was more than a compliment, it was an acknowledgement. Alistair Finch, seeing the situation stabilized and his PR nightmare averted, immediately moved to reclaim control. He puffed out his chest, straightening his tie, his face morphing from terror to a mask of managerial authority. He strode over to Alara, his expression one of deep disapproval. "That was the most reckless, unprofessional, and dangerous display I have ever witnessed," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "You violated every protocol. You are a lawsuit waiting to happen." Alara slowly rose to her feet. She was exhausted, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. She had just saved a man's life in front of 100 witnesses, and all he could see was a broken rule. "Thank you for your service, nurse," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he dismissed her with a flick of his hand. "You may go. We'll be having a serious discussion about your future employment, or lack thereof, in the morning." He turned his back on her, intending to escort the general's team, to smooth things over, to take credit for his hospital's miraculous save. He took 2 steps before a quiet voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Finch!" It was Colonel Evans. He hadn't left with the gurney. He was standing right there, his posture relaxed, but radiating an aura of absolute, immovable authority that made Finch's manufactured power seem like a child's tantrum. Finch turned, a sycophantic smile already forming on his lips. "Colonel, on behalf of St. Jude's, I want to apologize for the—" "A word," Evans interrupted, his voice quiet but as sharp as a razor's edge. He gestured with his head toward a nearby concrete pillar, away from the lingering press and hospital staff. "In private." The smile froze on Finch's face. The tone was not one of gratitude. It was an order. He hesitated, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. He was the CEO. He wasn't used to being summoned. "Now," Evans added, his gaze unwavering. The color drained from Finch's face. He looked from the colonel's stony expression to the departing gurney, then back. Slowly, like a man walking to his own execution, he followed Evans to the pillar. Elara watched them go. The rest of the lobby seemed to fade into a blur. She could only see the two men. Evans was speaking, his voice too low to hear, his expression unreadable. Finch was listening, his head slightly bowed. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the story on Finch's body. At first, he tried to nod along, a flicker of his usual arrogance still present. Then, his posture began to collapse. His shoulders slumped. His hands, which had been clasped behind his back in a show of confidence, came around to hang limply at his sides. He grew paler, his skin taking on a waxy, clammy sheen under the bright lobby lights. He looked like a man who had just been shown a photograph of his own gravestone. The conversation lasted no more than 90 seconds. When it was over, Evans clapped Finch once on the shoulder. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a gesture of dismissal, of finality. Finch flinched as if he'd been struck. Evans turned and walked away from him without a backward glance, leaving the CEO of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital standing alone by a concrete pillar, visibly trembling. Elara's heart was pounding. What had Evans said to him? What did he know? Her question was answered a moment later. Colonel Evans didn't follow the gurney out the door. Instead, he walked directly toward her. He stopped a respectful few feet away, his hard eyes now holding a new light. It was a look of profound, professional respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now devoid of its earlier command, replaced by a quiet deference that was more stunning than any shout. The word ma'am from a man like this was not a courtesy. It was a recognition of rank, earned or formal. Elara simply nodded, unsure of what to say. The general would like to extend his personal gratitude, Evans continued, his gaze direct. He is alive because of you. We are all in your debt. I was just doing my job, she murmured, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. A faint smile touched the corner of Evans's mouth. No, ma'am, you weren't. You were doing ours. It's been a while. Valkyrie. The name, her old call sign, a name no one had spoken in 8 years. It hit her with the force of a physical blow, a ghost from a past she had sealed away. Hearing it here, in this sterile hospital lobby, felt surreal, like a dream bleeding into reality. Her composure, so carefully maintained, finally cracked. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of her own shock was visible on her face. Evans saw it, and his expression softened slightly. Your signal was received, faint but clear. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, unassuming business card. It was black, with no name, just a satellite phone number and a single, embossed emblem, the stylized eagle of the Joint Special Operations Command. He held it out to her. The general also asked me to give you this, and to ask a question on his behalf. He paused, his eyes scanning the lobby, ensuring no one was close enough to hear. He wants to know if you are operating under duress at this facility. The phrase was clinical, military, operating under duress. It wasn't, is your boss a jerk? It was, are you a friendly asset in a compromised position? It was an offer of extraction, an offer of help. Elara looked from the card in his hand to the pathetic figure of Alistair Finch, who was now being warily approached by his own board members. She thought of his words, replaceable, a cog in a machine. She took the card from Evans's hand. The thick cardstock felt solid, real, a lifeline. She met the colonel's gaze, and for the first time since the crisis began, she let a sliver of her true self show. the cold professional fury she had suppressed for so long. "Affirmative, Colonel," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the strength of forged steel. "The situation here is untenable." Evans nodded once, a deep and final acknowledgement. "Understood. We'll be in touch within the hour. Stay clear of Mr. Finch. He is no longer a factor." And with that, he turned and strode out of the lobby, leaving Alara standing alone in the center of the room, the world tilting on its axis. The chaos was subsiding, replaced by an eerie, questioning silence. Everyone was staring at her, the quiet nurse, the one Finch had humiliated just hours before. She was no longer part of the background. She was the focal point of everything. She looked down at the black card in her hand. It was more than a phone number. It was a key to a door she thought she had locked and sealed forever. The next morning, the hospital was buzzing with a nervous energy that was entirely different from the day before. Alistair Finch was not in his office. His reserved parking space was empty. No one had seen him, and his assistants were fielding calls with panicked, evasive answers. Rumors were flying like sparks in a high wind. Alara had gone home after the incident, her mind a whirlwind. She had slept for 3 fitful hours, the phantom weight of her old body armor pressing down on her. The call had come at 0400 hours, precise and expected. A clipped, professional voice on the other end had asked her to be available. Nothing more. She arrived for her shift to find the atmosphere transformed. The story of the general's collapse and her dramatic intervention had spread through every department. The way people looked at her had changed. The quiet respect had been replaced by awe, curiosity, and in some cases, fear. She was no longer Alara, the competent night nurse. She was a mystery. Around 10 in the morning, 2 men and a woman in dark, formal suits entered the ER. They were not from the hospital board. They moved with the same quiet, purposeful confidence as Colonel Evans. They were federal agents. They didn't ask for the head of the department. They asked for her. "Nurse Alara Vance?" the lead agent asked, flashing a badge. "FBI, we need you to come with us. You are not under arrest. We just need your statement." A hushed silence fell over the ER as they escorted her out. She walked with them, her back straight, her expression calm. This was the next step. This was the consequence of her actions, the fulfillment of Evans's promise. They didn't take her to a local field office. They drove her to a private hangar at a nearby municipal airport where a sleek, unmarked Gulfstream jet sat waiting on the tarmac. Colonel Evans was there to meet her at the steps of the plane. "Ma'am," he greeted her with a nod. "Thank you for coming. The general is stable and recovering. He's very insistent on speaking with you personally." Inside, the jet was converted into a state-of-the-art medical transport. General Thorne was sitting up in a comfortable chair, an IV line in his arm, but his color healthy, his eyes sharp and intelligent. The air of command was still there, softened now by a clear sense of mortality and gratitude. "Nurse Vance," he said, his voice a little rough but strong. "Or should I say, Staff Sergeant Vance, Para-Rescue, call sign Valkyrie, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Bronze Stars. You left the service 8 years ago after the incident in the Kandahar province. Your file is impressive and heavily redacted." Alara felt a chill go down her spine. They had her entire file. In less than 12 hours, they had unlocked a past she had thought was buried for good. "General," she said, her voice steady, "I'm just a civilian now." A civilian who performed an intracardiac injection in a lobby with 100 cameras watching, Thorne corrected her gently. A civilian who recognized a compromised supply chain in seconds. A civilian who knew a JSOC tap code that hasn't been in the field manual for 15 years. He paused, letting his words sink in. There's no such thing as just a civilian with a skill set like yours. He gestured to the seat opposite him. Please, sit. Evans tells me you confirmed the situation at St. Jude's was untenable. Ilara sat down, the plush leather a stark contrast to the hard plastic chairs of the ER. The hospital is being run into the ground, sir. Finch has been cutting costs everywhere. Staffing, supplies, equipment maintenance. He's obsessed with profit margins and public perception. Patient care is an afterthought. We know, Thorne said, his expression hardening. Your actions in the lobby did more than just save my life. You exposed a vulnerability we've been tracking for months. Alistair Finch wasn't just cutting corners. He was actively engaged in a conspiracy to defraud the government and endanger lives. Colonel Evans stepped forward, holding a tablet. He swiped the screen, showing a picture of the epinephrine auto-injector from the hospital crash cart next to a picture of an identical-looking one. Finch made a deal with an unsanctioned overseas pharmaceutical manufacturer, Evans explained, his voice cold and precise. He was purchasing critical medications, epinephrine, antibiotics, anticoagulants, at 1/10 of the market price and billing the government and insurance companies for the full amount. The products were cosmetically perfect but medically worthless. Inconsistent dosages, contaminated batches, expired ingredients. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. She thought of all the patients she had treated. How many times had a medication seemed less effective than it should have been? How many unexplained complications, how many deaths could be traced back to this? The auto-injector used on me yesterday contained less than 10% of the advertised epinephrine dose, the general continued, his voice laced with cold fury. It was poison by omission. We believe Finch's network has infiltrated dozens of hospitals. He was the linchpin. We were building a case, but it was all financial records and shipping manifests. We lacked definitive proof of medical failure. Until yesterday. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Your intervention provided that proof. You diagnosed the equipment failure in real time. You took decisive, unconventional action. You created an undeniable, publicly witnessed event. And you flagged yourself to my team as a friendly asset. You didn't just save me, Sergeant Vance. You blew their entire operation wide open. Ilara was speechless. The public humiliation, the threat, her split-second decision to act, it had all converged into this. It wasn't just about her and Finch anymore. It was about a vast, deadly conspiracy. What happens now? She finally asked. Now, the general said, with a grim smile, we clean house. Mr. Finch was taken into federal custody an hour ago. He's currently explaining his financial perspective to a team of men who don't care about profit margins. His board is being investigated. His suppliers are being rounded up. St. Jude's is about to be placed under new management, pending a full audit and recertification. The news was a vindication so total, so absolute, that it left her feeling lightheaded. Finch wasn't just fired, he was destroyed. His entire corrupt empire was crumbling because one replaceable nurse had refused to stand by and do nothing. But that's not why I asked you here, the general went on, his tone shifting. I didn't bring you here just to say thank you. I brought you here to offer you a job." Elara blinked. "Sir?" "A person with your unique combination of skills, elite medical training, field experience, and the ability to operate unseen within a civilian system is not just valuable. You're a unicorn," Thorne stated. "The problem you uncovered is bigger than just Finch. We need a way to ensure the integrity of the medical supply chain for both civilian and military facilities that serve our personnel. We need to build a new kind of oversight, a rapid response team that can audit, investigate, and intervene when we detect anomalies." He leaned back, his gaze intense. "I'm not asking you to put on a uniform again. I'm asking you to lead this team. You'll have my full authority, a substantial budget, and a hand-picked crew of specialists. Your job will be to hunt down the other Alistair Finches of the world, to protect our people from the inside. No more hiding your skills. No more pretending to be just a cog in the machine. It's a chance to use everything you are, everything you've learned." He was offering her a purpose. Not just a job, but a mission. A mission that perfectly aligned with the skills she had been forced to suppress for so long. The part of her that was Valkyrie, the part that ran toward the sound of chaos, the part that knew how to fix what was broken under fire. She looked out the small window of the jet at the clouds below. She had spent 8 years trying to be small, to be quiet, to be invisible. She had convinced herself that was safety, but the truth was it had been a cage of her own paranoia and past trauma. Finch hadn't built that cage, but his arrogance had shown her the bars, and General Thorne was now handing her the key. She turned back to him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in what felt like years. It was a smile of quiet, exhausted relief, but also of triumphant, rekindled fire. "When do I start?" she asked. 3 months later, a press conference was held on the steps of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. The cameras were back, but the atmosphere was one of solemn renewal. A new CEO, a retired admiral with a reputation for uncompromising integrity, was speaking about the hospital's new charter of patient-first ethics. In the crowd, standing off to the side, was a woman in a sharply tailored navy blue suit. Her hair was pulled back in a severe professional knot. She watched the proceedings with a calm, analytical gaze. She looked like a government official, a consultant, an authority figure. No one would have recognized her as the quiet, unassuming nurse who had once walked these halls. Elara Vance was no longer part of the background. She was the one who observed from the shadows, her eyes missing nothing. Her new office was not in a hospital, but in a secure, nondescript building in Washington, D.C. Her days were spent reviewing intelligence reports, dispatching her teams, and briefing generals and senators. She had traded her scrubs for a suit that felt more like armor than any she had ever worn before. A young aide, a bright-eyed Air Force lieutenant, approached her and handed her a tablet. "Ma'am, the preliminary report from the Phoenix audit is in, just like you predicted." Elara took the tablet. Her eyes scanned the data, the telltale signs of financial and medical irregularities she was now an expert at spotting. Another Alistair Finch, another web of corruption, another mission. She nodded, handing the tablet back. "Good, prep the team. We fly out at 1800. "Yes, ma'am," the lieutenant said, snapping a crisp salute before hurrying away. Elara lingered for a moment longer, listening to the new CEO promise a future of transparency and accountability. She thought of Finch, now facing a lifetime in federal prison, his name a byword for greed and corruption. She thought of the general, now fully recovered and back on duty. She had not been replaced. She had been reborn. The fire she had tried so hard to extinguish had been stoked into a controlled, purposeful flame. She was not a victim. She was not a cog. She was a weapon, honed by her past and finally aimed in the right direction. And she was just getting started. She turned away from the hospital, the sounds of the press conference fading behind her. She had a plane to catch. There was work to do. I want to thank you for coming on this journey with me tonight. If you enjoy stories where the underestimated rise up and the corrupt get what they deserve, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Your support is what makes it possible for me to keep telling them. And for my question tonight, have you ever had a moment in your own life where a skill you thought was useless suddenly became the most important thing in the room? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you again for watching. I've already queued up another story for you on the screen, and I think you're going to love it. I'll see you there.